Francis himself wrote marvelous books about how important it was to understand the spiritual life and the mystical life and the devout life, the religious life, so that we would see that it's a marvelous way to live, that it balances perfectly our human desires and the realities of life in the world. We know that our times are probably as turbulent as his. We know that the great forces now are not another religion, but many times the great issue of secularism. We know that the human spirit is degraded in a secular culture. We know that it's almost impossible to be fully human without God and the graces of God.
We know St. Francis de Sales for many things. He was a missionary, a writer, a founder of a religious order, but first and foremost, he was a bishop who cared for his people. He would walk down to town every day from this place and would preach this message of love, inspired, no doubt, in this place each and every day with this magnificent, ancient image of Christ being the light of the world.
Francis de Sales lived most of his life in Savoy, a province that has moved between France, Switzerland, and Italy throughout the centuries. Francis was born of an ancient noble family on August 21st, 1567, at the castle of Torin near Annecy, France. Francis was the eldest of 13 children. When he was 15, he was sent to Paris to study at the Jesuit College of Clermont. He then went on to the University of Padua in Italy to study law. Francis was aware of his calling to the priesthood since he was a small boy. However, he did not discuss these secret religious yearnings to anyone but his mother. After graduating with a doctorate in legal studies and theology, he pursued his vocation. On December 21st, 1593, Francis de Sales celebrated his first Mass in Annecy. In 1598, Francis was consecrated Bishop of Geneva. However, he was banned from that city due to the Reformation. De Sales wanted to debate John Calvin, one of the leaders of the Reformation, but that never happened. St. Francis de Sales is the patron saint of journalists because of the pamphlets he wrote to present the true Catholic position on the issues of faith. Francis de Sales considered preaching to be one of his main responsibilities. He once said, "Only the language of the heart can reach another heart, while the tongue does not get past your listener's ear." Francis is also the patron saint of the deaf because of a sign language he created for a deaf servant in his household. St. Francis de Sales is a doctor of the Church due to his masterful writings. He and Jane de Chantal are considered the founders of Christian humanism. Francis de Sales died on December 28, 1622. He was buried in Annecy.
A young girl who had finished lunch with her family. She and her brother went to play, and she unexpectedly fell into the river. The fast-flowing currents took her several meters downstream, and she was underwater for at least 45 minutes. Courageous gentlemen jumped into the river, pulled her body out of the river, but she was already bloated and in fact already dead. The townspeople, of course, got her family. Her mother went into the church to pray, prayed to Francis de Sales for her little daughter. She kept crying out, ma fille, her, please help me, save my daughter. Apparently he did. For some time later, there in the room that they had taken the young girl to and laid her on the bed, the servants called the family in suddenly, for the girl was sitting up. Her mother ran into the room and the girl said, "Mom, I'm hungry. We know this not to be just legend, but to be the truth, because later that young girl grew up, and when the process was undertaken for canonizing Francis de Sales, many witnesses to his life were called, and this young girl was one of them. And she told the story of her own dying and coming back to life because of St. Francis de Sales.
Knowledge is an essential component of the human person. Francis actually said at one time that if the clergy of his time had been knowledgeable about the Catholic faith, the Reformation would have never occurred. They just weren't trained properly or taught properly the great truths, and that led to all kinds of problems. He actually wanted knowledge to be the eighth sacrament of the church, especially for the clergy. And so he instituted all kinds of changes in terms of how to educate people well.
We're here at the home of Madame de Chamoisy. She is famous for being the Philothea of St. Francis de Sales. St. Francis de Sales wrote a number of letters to Madame de Chamoisy, and these letters eventually became the subject of his most famous work, The Introduction to the Devout Life.
Of the many innovations Francis de Sales began here as a bishop, one was the teaching of the catechism. He invented that practice of instructing young people in the church. And so what he would do in this grand church of Saint Maurice is he would call the children together to give them instructions in the faith. The children would gather, and the numbers grew in this church, so much so that the children's families began to join them. And so the church was filled, and Francis would ascend to the pulpit and teach them the basics of their faith. And one day, Francis de Sales' own mother came to the church, sat just below him in the pew. And as Francis, the bishop, looked out and was teaching people about the faith, he stopped. He looked at his mother and said in his eloquent French, "Mother, why are you here? You are the one who taught this to me." And thus he instituted this practice of what we now call CCD, and is the patron saint of the confraternity of Christian doctrine, because of his personal desire to teach the next generation what we believe.
The order was set up in 1610, and it was under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit that St. Francis de Sales, the Bishop of Geneva, was inspired to found the order. And the desire of his heart was that he would form sisters contemplatives, so interior, to be able to devote it to adoring the Divine Majesty and consoling the hearts of Jesus, and particularly the hearts of Jesus and Mary. And it was founded in coordination with Saint Jeanne de Chantal, who was a widow and had the inspiration supported to it through St. Francis de Sales. And the order was founded in Annecy. The visitation is an order of complete simplicity and gentleness and meekness of spirit. It's not a strict order where it has strict fasts and mortifications. It's particularly to work an interior mortification, and mortification of our thoughts and movements of our hearts, thus leaving us more open to be divinely united with Jesus through him.
We know that both Jane and Francis lived in very turbulent times. In one sense, a great 1,000-year tradition was coming to an end. Francis and Jane were completely convinced that a humanism was indeed needed. They understood that it was very problematic that a king or a duke would determine the religion of people, would determine the nationality of people, that these things, by their very nature, had to become personal. And so they embraced the Enlightenment idea of the humanisms with great enthusiasm. They were not holding on to the past. They said, this is really good stuff. But the great Christian tradition offered incredibly important insights into this humanism. And they wanted to make sure that the new humanism would be infused with the spirits of Christianity and Catholicism. And so they wanted to make sure that religious values were seen as essential to humanity.
Do not think that God is further away from you when you are in the midst of the busyness to which your vocation calls than he would be if you were enjoying a tranquil life. No, it is not in tranquility which brings him close to our hearts. It is rather the fidelity of our love. It is not the feeling we have of his sweetness, but the consent we give to his holy will. Remember this well. We are sometimes so busy being good angels that we neglect to be good men and women. Our imperfections are going to accompany us to the grave. We can't go anywhere without having our feet on the ground. Let us be firmly resolved to serve God with our whole heart and life. Beyond that, let us have no care about tomorrow. Let us think only of living today well, and when tomorrow comes, it also will be today, and we can think about it then. Let us not waste time in willing and wishing for things, but let God arrange them. He wishes for us whatever is best.
And we thank the Lord for inviting us to be a part of this journey that ends only when we encounter the really real thing. Francis and Jane at the gates of paradise, welcoming us with all of the great souls that are a part of this Salesian tradition.